Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for attending today. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all working on across the country and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also any Aboriginal people here today. I'm on Boonwurrung land, also known as Melbourne, and as Chris said, I'm Nicole Lee. I'm the CEO of 360 Edge, and I'm also adjunct professor at the National Drug Research Institute at Curtin University. My background's in psychology. I've been working in the drug and alcohol and mental health areas for a very long time, about 30-something years. All right, so in the last few years, we have seen, dare I say, a sobering reminder to all of us about the critical role that workplaces can play in responding to alcohol and other drug issues. A couple of recent reviews, one into bullying and harassment in federal parliament, and the other, the Broderick report, into bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct in the New South Wales Parliament, both highlighted how entwined a toxic workplace culture and poorly managed alcohol and other drug use can be. And the recent WA parliamentary inquiry into sexual harassment against women in the FIFO mining industry also highlighted increased risk to health and safety that alcohol and other drugs poses. So the problem is well known. And in fact, sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace, most of it occurs after alcohol use. Alcohol and other drug use is not the cause of these problems, obviously, but it does significantly magnify the risk and the severity of the problem. It also intersects with a whole package of other psychosocial risk factors in the workplace that amplifies alcohol and drug use, morbidity and risk. Things like, as well as bullying and harassment, things like poor support, unclear job roles, conditions of work. And as well as that, nearly 20% of lost productivity costs are directly related to alcohol and other drug use. So that cost is in the billions every year to Australian businesses. And although many workplaces worry about illicit drugs, most of that lost productivity, and in fact, most of the harm, is caused by alcohol. Only 1% of absenteeism, for example, is of drug-related absenteeism is illicit drug-related. And incidentally, most of that is cannabis. I think the important thing to note is that it's not just the people with severe problems that make up these statistics. More than half of the people that contribute to this lost productivity are infrequent or occasional risky drinkers. So they're big drinkers on the weekend, for example, but they don't drink every day. 11% of accidents and injuries involve alcohol. Surprisingly, very few accidents involve illicit drugs. But what all of this kind of tells us is that we really need to pay attention across the use continuum and have a range of responses from prevention to treatment. So alcohol and other drugs play a really key role in increasing a range of negative outcomes for workers and for workplaces more generally. On the flip side of that, we know that there are significant benefits to good drug and alcohol policy in the workplace, including improvements in diversity and inclusion for women, but for also people from religious or cultural backgrounds where alcohol is not a central feature, as well as productivity improvements, reduced turnover, and improved workplace engagement. So most people who drink or take drugs are employed. It means that it's not just a really important issue to address from a workplace safety perspective, but also it's an amazing opportunity to utilise the workplace to reduce risky or harmful use more generally, and also to create a healthier, happier workplace. But when we look at the problems attributable to alcohol and drugs, most of them are actually not due to use at work. So typically people are not kind of cracking a beer in the lunchroom or sneaking a line of Coke in the toilets. Most industries have also got rid of that kind of long boozy lunch a long time ago. And even where that does still happen, most workplaces would expect you not to come back to work, and often that's written into policy. Much of the use that impacts on the workplace tends to be at things like work functions or after hours unofficial work gatherings like Friday night drinks, for example. And that means that most of the problems for most workplaces are actually in the after effects of alcohol and drug use, not in intoxication itself. So for safety sensitive industries, it's immediate safety, yes, but it's also not just immediate safety on the work site that we need to pay attention to. The primary problems are absenteeism, so people taking a sickie because they've had a big weekend, or presenteeism, so dragging themselves to work still, but with a hangover or not having enough sleep, which potentially results in reduced productivity and reduced safety, of course. Or especially in male-dominated industries, a non-inclusive culture can develop with social activities kind of occurring around heavy drinking or blokey kind of activities that naturally include alcohol.
Nicole, if I could just ask you a question. We have a question from one of the participants, and I'd also encourage everyone, I should have said this at the beginning, my apologies, in the Q&A box, feel free to ask any questions in there, and we can pick them up either throughout or at the end. There's just a quick question around the collection of statistics on workplace accidents related to AOD use. Where do they come from? And I imagine we can send out those references after, along with the presentation, but perhaps you could, I don't know, you're probably going to go into the process, but there's just a question there around that.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. Yes, there's a range of data sets that I've drawn on, and I can certainly send out those to anyone who's interested after. Right, so the biggest mistake I think that organisations make in developing alcohol and drug policy is placing too much emphasis on alcohol and drug use at work, which naturally kind of leads to a focus on drug testing. And that's important, especially in safety sensitive industries, but it's not the whole picture. If a large proportion of the negative impacts are not from people using at work or being intoxicated at work, a policy that's solely based around testing or primarily based around testing even is not going to be enough to address a broader issue about alcohol and drugs. And also taking into consideration that not even in safety sensitive industries, not everyone goes on to a dangerous work site. There's a range of people also in office and other settings. So you might also be surprised to know that testing doesn't identify most workers who use alcohol and other drugs. It doesn't deter workers from using substances. It just changes what they use and when they use and where they use it. Doesn't reliably identify workers who are impaired and therefore dangerous on a work site either. What a negative test tells us is that a person is probably not impaired from drugs, at least the drugs that are tested for. But on the flip side of that, a positive test actually doesn't necessarily indicate that they're impaired. And that's especially the case for illicit drugs. It's a little bit different for alcohol. There is a direct relationship between a blood alcohol concentration and impairment. So testing is great for reducing the likelihood that immediate safety is compromised. Of course, we don't want anyone kind of getting behind the wheel of some massive truck or operating heavy machinery while they're impaired by alcohol and drugs. So it helps with that piece of it, but it doesn't help us with the other workplace impacts, which can be just as important for workplaces and for workers. It also raises a number of dilemmas. So what do you do with workers who use other drugs that are not part of the testing regime? These tests only test for a limited number of common drugs, but you might be surprised to know in the last 10 years, more than 1,000 new drugs have been reported to have been developed. We also know that often people don't necessarily stop using drugs, they just potentially switch to other drugs that are not tested for. And one of the theories about the rise in methamphetamine use and ice is that at least around 10 or 15 years ago, there was a very heavy focus, particularly in the mining and resources industry, on testing for cannabis. But they didn't routinely test for methamphetamine. And so people just shifted away from using cannabis to using something else, methamphetamine. And then we had more people using meth. And then there's a question about what we do about people who are possibly impaired from other things like prescription drugs, which we aren't testing for. There is an argument that it is difficult to recognise impairment from alcohol and other drugs. So it's kind of safer and easier to use use or testing results as an easy proxy. But it's actually only an easy proxy for some kinds of impairment. And if you think about other impairments in the workplace, from fatigue and stress, mental or physical health problems, for example, there's also no objective measures for those impairments either, but we are able to recognise those risks and respond to them in the workplace. So if we move away from this idea of impairment from alcohol and drugs to just impairment, we can apply the same criteria as some of those other impairments, and alcohol and other drug use then becomes just one other piece of a kind of larger impairment pie. As they say, prevention is better than cure. So the question then becomes, how do we encourage a healthy workplace culture that ensures everyone is healthy and fit for work? And what we want to do is to develop a culture where workers are committed to be fit for work, not where they're kind of avoiding sanctions or trying to get around rules. And we want to develop a culture that values wellbeing and psychological safety in the workplace. And we want a workplace that is interested in workers' general mental and physical health and provides the right conditions for a fit workforce. We know that organisations that take this more holistic approach, one that's kind of focused on promoting health rather than sanctioning breaches, and one that focuses on worker wellbeing and fitness for work, can result in a number of significant benefits for the business. It leads to cultural change, it naturally reduces use, it increases productivity, and it improves the overall health of the workforce. So that's the approach that we take at 360 to build our organisational policy development work around, this kind of broader idea of worker wellbeing, rather than focusing on alcohol and drug use itself, thinking about alcohol and drug use as part of a whole wellbeing package. So I just want to spend a little bit of time before we finish talking about the 6-step framework that we have developed over about a decade now working in this area. These are all the kind of component parts that you need to think about when developing policy. And within that, the methodology and the tasks and the activities are kind of flexed, so they're fully tailored to the current need of the organisation. But we think that all 6 of these areas need to be given some consideration. So one example of a recent client that we were working with in the resources area wanted to develop and deliver a new alcohol policy, which was in addition to their existing policies. And the organisation already had a few different options about what the policy would look like, but they had a kind of few decision points where they needed some technical expertise. So as part of this kind of step 1 and step 2 in this diagram, we undertook an environmental scan of best practice approaches to managing alcohol in the resources industry, and we undertook a brief risk assessment by looking at the options that were on the table and the possible unintended consequences of going forward with each of these options. The company itself did the collaborative design consultation, and they drafted the policy in-house themselves. and we provided a light touch kind of review and some high level input into that. And then we spent most of our effort on delivering the policy and disseminating the policy. So we developed up a plan for dissemination, and we developed up a range of resources, videos, paper resources, online resources for workers and for managers. The evaluation component was also undertaken in-house in the company. So in this model, not every single stage has to be a huge mammoth effort, but there are certain important considerations within each stage that need to be considered. Right, that was just a quick example. All right, so just before we finish, let me just recap and think about where that kind of leaves us. So over time, as general knowledge and awareness has grown of the impact of alcohol and other drugs in the workplace, our thinking has shifted, and the general thinking in industry has shifted from a focus on physical safety and therefore on testing, to broaden that focus out to productivity and therefore an emphasis on identifying impairment, to now an even broader focus on a healthy and psychologically safe workplace, and therefore moving alcohol and other drug responses into the mainstream of policy in the workplace, to focus on really encouraging a workplace culture that values wellbeing and psychosocial safety. That's about all I have to say. If there's any other questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole. So I just had a few questions sent through to me. The first one is in an industry that is highly unionized, and you have different perceptions on an impairment and rules. What are the kind of bigger themes that you see across the companies that can be applied across more broadly to different types of companies or different types of sectors in terms of doing this well, as opposed to having to do it bespoke every single time?
Yeah, right. I think the really critical piece is stakeholder engagement, and really deep stakeholder engagement. If you do everything else lightly, the stakeholder piece is the piece you want to spend a lot of time on. And the companies that we've worked with over the last few years, the ones that have been most successful in implementation are the ones that have brought the unions, the workers, the managers, frontline workers and managers along with them, and also sometimes external stakeholders that need to have a say as well. And it doesn't, it sounds easier obviously than it is to do, because there are different opinions, but the organisations we've worked with have always managed to land on a space of somewhere in the middle where it's acceptable for everyone, or at least understandable to everybody.
Another one, what's your kind of thoughts on the intersection between mental health and AOD policy? How do these two things play out in your mind, and how do companies do them well?
Yeah, I think it's why it's really important to have that idea of this kind of impairment pie, or all the things that could possibly impact on worker health and wellbeing, addressed under either linked or the same policies, because they're interrelated, they're deeply interrelated, particularly alcohol and drug issues. People stressed at home or stressed at work, they're more likely to drink or take drugs. That makes their workplace less safe, and it kind of all cycles together, and also goes the other way. People drinking a lot or drug taking tend to have higher mental health issues. So and also not forgetting things like just stress. Even if people don't have moderate to severe mental health issues like anxiety or depression, just stress or fatigue or those kinds of things also impact on both mental health and alcohol and drug use.
There's a question here around stigma. You've worked in this sort of field for 30 years. Do you see the stigma around conversations within companies and in the community as changing, or, what do you see as some of the trends around that?
Yeah, I certainly think that shift from kind of testing to a broader wellness type of approach to drug policy, it reflects a lessening of stigma. There's still massive amounts of stigma, which is also the benefit of kind of bringing the alcohol and drug policy under a wider banner. But I think that shift to a health and wellbeing and psychological safety approach moves away from that kind of drugs are bad, and if you do drugs, you're a bad person type of thinking. And so I have seen a shift in terms of reducing stigma. There's still a long way to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction for sure.
And the last question here sent through is, what's a company that you've seen do this really well? What's an example? Maybe not necessarily in safety sensitive companies, but one that really has a gold standard approach to drug and alcohol policy in their company.
So I'd really love to answer that question with specifics, but most of our clients, or all of our clients, prefer to be anonymous, and we like to keep that confidence. And so I don't want to name names unless they're prepared to kind of put their hand up. But I think that what I can say is that we've worked with some big international companies, and we've worked with some very small companies, and it can be done successfully right along that continuum if it's done in the right way, in a thoughtful way, in a really planned way. With some, I think that one of the other things that we've found is that sometimes workplaces will kind of see how far we can get on our own, and then they'll call in some kind of more technical expertise to kind of round it off, and that often works too.
Amazing. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar with us. This is the first one that we've done for this sector. We've done them within the health sector across primary health networks and service providers in the AOD field, and this is the first time that we've done it in the corporate sector. And we are going to send out an evaluation form, because what we found is we'd love to dig into specific challenges and share the expertise across the 360 team with a specific challenge that you have that might be useful for more people. So please share that with us, and we run these to improve our mission across the country. So we'd love your feedback on today's session and any ideas on future webinars that we can do with an aim that we want to continue to grow our work across safety sensitive companies and continue to have an impact on more Australians that we can. So thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in the next time.
Thanks everyone.